welcome to the Evansville Wartime Museum. Continue eating. We're going to get started here with our program in just a second. Nice turnout today. This is the topic I think a lot of us are very interested in. It's kind of why I'm so good. Before we get into it too much, Larry Head bless the food.
Heavenly Father, we ask you to be with us as we gather today to hear about those who served our country during the Battle of the Bulge and the great conflict of World War II. Please remember them and all who have gone before us in service of this great nation. We ask for your protection on all now serving in the armed forces and also all law first responders. Please bless all gathered here, our family and our friends. We thank you for the food we have to enjoy today and ask you to extend your blessing to all those who prepare and serve it. All this we ask in your name. Amen.
Amen. And I'd like to say how thankful we are to have this man back. I know all of you that have been here a lot, but this guy right here is an awful lot. We welcome you back. Very glad to have you. So, we're going to pass these tasks. Now, a lot of you maybe wonder what we do with this money. Well, this is a very important thing for basically our outreach. This money goes to a grant program that we use to fund for youth, underprivileged youth to come into the museum. So it's something that we put to good use. Your contributions are well, we need your money. I'll just be real frank. I sound like my wife now. I need your money. But anyway, so when we pass the hat, if you're under no obligation, but if you can help us out, we'd really appreciate it. Don's going to come up here and start that. And so a couple other announcements before we get started. In 2 weeks, we have another really interesting speaker coming up. In fact, he's here today. His name is Bill Waters, and he's going to talk to you about the failed attempt to rescue the hostages in Iran back in 1980. So that's something I know very little about, so that ought to be a very interesting topic for all of us. So we'll look forward to maybe seeing all of you come back here today. I think this is our biggest turnout we've ever had today, so we're pretty pleased about that. So Donna, as you know, this museum is always evolving. And we've got some new exhibits coming open, and Donna Bone here has put a lot of hours into this kitchen. She's going to tell you a little bit about that, so we're very pleased to open that up today.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Evansville Wartime Museum. Big groups here today. A lot of you are regulars, but I understand we have a lot of new folks here today. Raise your hand if this is your first time at one of these Lunch and Learn and Share programs. Wow, impressive, impressive. Speaking of new, as Jason said, we have a brand new exhibit that's open to the public for the first time today. It's the Jan and Tom Howell World War II Kitchen and Dining Room. So, our museum focuses a lot on the military efforts from our local soldiers throughout the wars. We focus a lot in the Homefront Gallery on the contributions of a lot of the factories that were here in the area and the items they produced to provide supplies for the military. So this is an extra part of the Homefront exhibit. It takes a look at the average American household and what life was like for these households during World War II. Of course, there's a lot of rationing going on. They're collecting grease, they're collecting paper, they're collecting scrap metal. We've got examples of the Serval Electrolux refrigerator made in Evansville. Life wasn't easy for families at the time, and we just wanted to make sure that the folks of today, especially the kids, understood some of the sacrifices that were made by those families. It feels like you're walking through an actual house. So there's a kitchen, and then right next to it, we have a dining room. So if you have time after today's program, please stop by and let the folks over there to share information from you and tell you a little bit about what's going on in the house. Thank you.
I went through that last night, and it's very impressive. She's done just a lot of work on that, so if you've got a few minutes after we're done here today, it's well worth your time to go see it. It's very impressive. One other thing I'd like to bring your attention to, the public library has a table set up back here, and so if you needed any help for their use for research purposes, they are there to help you. And, we're very thankful for them for all they do and the support they give us out here, okay? I'm going to bring Larry back up today, and he's going to do the Pledge of Allegiance and our national anthem.
Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance first. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Now you can join me in singing the national anthem. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave.
Larry. All right, I'm going to introduce our speaker today, which is, again, Willis is his name. He's a retired colonel. We'll read a little about him. He was commissioned in 1958. He served for 30 years, in the Maryland, Ohio, and Kentucky National Guard, the U.S. Army Reserve, and on active duty. His commendations include the Legion of Merit, Meritorious Service Medal with Oak Leaf Clusters, the Joint Service Accommodation Medal, Army Accommodation Medal with Oak Leaf Clusters, Infantry Badge, Parachute Badge, Secretary of Defense Identification Badge. He was in the Fort Benning OCS Hall of Fame, Indiana Veterans Hall of Fame, class of 2021, and he's the general manager now of WFLQ in French Lick, Indiana. So give him a good welcome to the Evansville Wartime Museum to Bill Willis.
Good morning. This is the day the Lord has made. We will rejoice. And see all those lumens out. The weather we've been having is much like the weather that General Patton experienced in 1944. And he was praying for exactly what we're getting today, so that those P-47 Thunderbolts could knock out the German tanks that were holding him up in his objective of getting to Bastogne. Well, it's always a pleasure to be with this group. By the way, how many of you were born between 1930 and 1945? But you are the 1%ers. Did you know that only 1% of your generation is still alive on this planet? And you are a part of the generation, which was the smallest generation in the last century. You're part of the generation that remembers saving tinfoil from chewing gum and cigarette wrappers. You're part of the generation that remembers victory gardens. Did you know that 40% of all the produce raised in America came from victory gardens raised in your backyards and in churchyards around America? You're part of the generation that remembers saving tin cans. You're part of the generation that remembers that you couldn't just throw away something and buy a new one. You had to fix whatever you had or you didn't have it. And so you're a conservative generation. You're a generation that remembers the results of the Depression and were steeled by that experience. And that experience certainly led to the resolution, the grit of the GIs of World War II. Well, how many of you might have come today thinking that you were going to learn something about how to lose weight in this Battle of the Bulge? A school teacher asked her elementary class why they should appreciate veterans. And one little girl says, I know we should appreciate our veterans because they fought so that we could pay taxes to America and not to England. And on the way down here, I was followed by a state trooper, and I remembered my seatbelt. I was thinking about the man that was pulled over, and as soon as he saw the flashing light in his rearview mirror, he grabbed his seatbelt, put it up, and pulled over. The state trooper came over. Says, tell me, sir, you always wear your seatbelt? I said, oh, yes, I always wear a seatbelt. Well, tell me, do you always wear it hooked through the steering wheel? Well, we're going to be talking a little bit about the greatest battle that the United States Army was involved in all of World War II. This Battle of the Bulge is a very interesting battle because it has three colossal elements to it. The first of all was the colossal move that Hitler managed to complete in a 2.5-month period. Now, in September of 1944, when the Germans had been driven back to the Roar River and they were falling back all along the line, he came up with an idea. The idea was to make a drive through the Ardennes where the Allies would not suspect an attack to occur. The colossal logistics accomplishments included, first of all, the fact that he assembled 25 German divisions while the withdrawal was occurring. It was 25 divisions in 2.5 months. Some 7,000 armored vehicles. And all of this was done in secret. And what's amazing is we had the ultra secret back then, but we still did not penetrate that logistical accomplishment. Now, there were a few Americans and Brits who suspected the possibility, but most of our American senior leaders did not think it was possible for Germany to mount an offensive. They didn't have the manpower, so we thought. They didn't have the manufacturing capability to replace all of their lost tanks, so we thought. And they certainly didn't have the gasoline in order to make this dramatic move that actually occurred. So it was a colossal logistics accomplishment of Hitler. And by the way, Hitler planned this for mid-December when the weather was much like what we just experienced. 4 to 6 inches of snow, overcast for many days, which would prevent the Allies from using our massive air power, the P-47. And also, we did not think about the fact that history could repeat itself. Now, Hitler knew that. Hitler knew that the Germans had mounted an effective offensive 3 times before them. 1870, Frederick the Great went through that same Ardennes path. Then in 1914, the Germans attacked France through that same corridor, through the Ardennes, thought to be impenetrable. And then in 1940, Hitler did it again through Guderian. And they attacked through the Ardennes, knocked out France in a month. So with 3 successful penetrations through that same route, Hitler thought this was going to work. What was the objective? Well, the objective was Antwerp. And let's see what. Whoop. Okay, this is no. All right, here we go. The 2 major objectives in Hitler's plan, and this was a personal plan of his. When his senior generals tended to argue or to want to discuss this and point out the problems with this plan, he wouldn't hear it. He knew about the 3 successful German attacks this same area. He could do it again. And so his objectives were St. Vith, which I just saw there in a minute. There we go. St. Vith and Bastogne. Those 2 areas, those 2 communities, those 2 towns, he had to take. And he had to do it in 24 hours because the Germans did not have enough petrol in order to keep this attack moving. So he had to capture the Allies' gasoline supplies in order to make it all the way to Antwerp, which was their objective. And the whole purpose of Hitler's plan was to split the 12th Army Group in the south and the 21st Army Group, the Brits, in the north. So this was Bradley's 21st Army Group, consisting of 3 U.S. armies, one of which was the 3rd Army, Patton's 3rd Army in the south, and he was down here in Luxembourg. And the Netherlands, the Brits, in the 21st Army Group under Montgomery, also had 3 armies, and they were all making successful penetrations to Germany along this is the Rhine was their objective, our Allies' objective. Anyway, the Allied commanders did not consider the fact that the Germans had 3 times used this same route successfully. Now, one of the things that you all have heard before, the one thing we learn from history is that we learn nothing from history. And so it was with our Allied commanders, assuming that there was no possibility that an armored attack could occur through the Ardennes. But it happened, and they penetrated over 60 miles, broke through the American line, the Allied lines, but we were, at that point, assuming that the war was essentially over. We're just wrapping things up. And it did not seem possible that there could be an offensive here during this Christmas season. And so the front was quiet, and Montgomery, up in the northern sector, asked Ike for permission to go back to London, to go home for Christmas. And so that's the attitude that most of our allies had on the 16th of September, when at 5:30 in the morning, all hell broke loose. And an artillery barrage preceded the German attack. The attack occurred with 3 Panzer Corps in this southern sector in the 21st Army Group under Bradley. And at that time, Patton was down here in Luxembourg with the Third Army, but you see how far he had penetrated into in his mission to get to the Rhine, when the 16th of December, things changed. And Patton and the other Allied senior commanders were called to a meeting on the third day of the attack, when the Germans had penetrated more than halfway to the final point that they ran out of gas, and the Allies managed to stop their advance. So on the 19th of December, the senior commanders met and determined what could be done to stop this advance. It's interesting to note that when Patton learned about what had been done when the Germans broke through the 28th Division, the 28th Division, by the way, had a sector that was almost 25 miles wide to try to cover with 3 regiments. I mean, that's just... So obviously they were very, very thinly populated along that line. All they could do was man strong points with lots of unmanned terrain in between those strong points. And of course the Germans just whipped right through there with a Panzer Corps. Panzer Corps is 3 divisions, but they actually had 4 divisions facing the 28th, which is called the Bloody Bucket Division, Pennsylvania National Guard. It's a Pennsylvania Keystone in red, and after Bastogne, it was nicknamed the Bloody Bucket. They lost a lot of men, and the Germans have swept right through that sector. And when Patton learned about it, he wrote to his wife Beatrice in his diary and in a letter to her, "We could still lose this war." Now that was Patton. That was the man of guts and steel and thunder and lightning. And he had his doubts because this was so unexpected and so overwhelming. Let me back up for a moment to 1942. Patton had the advantage of his armored divisions being fielded with M4 tanks, just like the one you got back here, 1,600 of which were refurbished right here in Evansville during the war. By the way, this is really an amazing town. I mean, it's just unbelievable what you folks in Evansville and your predecessors managed to do in World War II. For 8,600 P-47s, produced a phenomenal amount of P-47s, the U.S. Army Air Corps, later Army Air Force. In itself, that would be quite an achievement for any city, anywhere in America. But that was only part of the story. You produced 167 LSTs. 167, the biggest producer of LSTs in the nation, way out here in Evansville, long ways from the Atlantic and the Pacific. Who would have thought it? You're producing 2 a day by the end of the war, 2 LSTs a day, 10 T-47s a day by the end of the war. You produced 1,600 of those M4 tanks that were refurbished right here in Evansville. So you're producing these for the Army and the Navy and the Army Air Corps, Army Air Force, as it became in 1942. Let alone the 97% of all of the 45 caliber ammunition produced the entire war came from Evansville. 97%. I salute you, Evansville, and that's only part of the story. You also produce things like this map case, and canteens, and cartridge belts, all kinds of additional support for our military, all of our services. All of it right here in Evansville. So 4,000 Army trucks were rebuilt here in Evansville. And that's only part of the story, but that's a phenomenal part of the story. So anyway, Evansville produced some of what General Patton was able to use in the Battle of the Bulge. Now, some of you are aware of the fact that Patton prayed for the weather to change. And all of us who are Christians know the power of prayer. Well, Patton knew the power of prayer. And Patton called his chaplain, Third Army chaplain, and he said, I want a weather prayer. Well, his chaplain had never had an order quite like that, but he said he would see what he could do. So, and he said, I want it right away. So the chaplain sat down and he wrote a prayer and went across the road to Patton's office. And this was the prayer that he offered to General Patton. Now, he didn't know what General Patton was going to do with it. He thought maybe it was just a personal prayer that he wanted. He had no idea what was going to happen. But the prayer was, Almighty and most merciful Father, we humbly beseech thee of thy great goodness to restrain these immoderate rains with which we have had to contend. Grant us fair weather for battle. Graciously hearken to us as soldiers who call upon thee, that armed with thy power we may advance from victory to victory and crush the oppression and wickedness of our enemies and establish thy justice among men and nations. Amen. Patton looked at the prayer. He said, publish 250,000 of them and get them to the Third Army as fast as possible. 250,000. Well, that prayer wound up in the hands of every GI in the Third Army. And with that mighty prayer and all those men of the Third Army in unison praying to the Almighty for a change in the weather, God changed the weather. And when he did, those P-47s took to the air. And Patton had had a lot of problems when the decision that had been made by the Allied senior commanders in implementing his plan. But how many of you have seen the movie Patton? All right, so you got an idea of what this is all about. The movie was good in many respects. It was the first movie that was done which employed an entire army at war. Most of them are about platoon, small units. But that one showed the great crisis that we were contending with in the Battle of the Bulge. But the weather had been a major problem because the Allies used air support. The Germans didn't always do that. They did, of course, with the Blitzkrieg. But in this case, with the Battle of the Bulge, they wanted secrecy, and that was the major element, this element of surprise that was going to make it possible to get to Antwerp. So the object, by the way, in getting to Antwerp, which was our major supply port, was to split the Brits from the Americans. And he figured if he could do that, that the Brits would sue for peace. If he didn't recognize the resolve of Churchill, but he thought strategically if he could break the Allies, that would make it possible for him to have a treaty, and that he could then withdraw much of the force that was used and employ it on the Eastern Front against the Russians. So that was his plan. And the one thing, by the way, you might be interested in knowing, what did the Germans think of the Americans? You ever thought about that? Now we know what our attitude was towards the enemy, both the Pacific and in Europe, but maybe you haven't always heard what the Germans thought about the Americans. And initially, it says at the beginning of both wars, and we had a lot of interrogations of German prisoners, and then after the war, many of them were interviewed. But here's one. At the beginning of both wars, the German military culture was producing some excellent soldiers, athletic discipline, able and willing to shoot. They had pride in their military. The Americans were a rather undisciplined bunch in the beginning. There were some really good American units, but they were few. For the most part, the Germans neither respected nor feared American troops. By the time D-Day was over, that changed, and the Americans had some battle-hardened troops who could and did defeat the Germans, even when numbers superiority was not on the American side. General McCulloch at the Battle of the Bulge was surrounded, and the numbers should have led to a wipeout. By the way, there was a Panzer Corps. A corps is 3 divisions. 3 divisions, each of which have 3 regiments. Each regiment has at least 3 battalions. So this was a Panzer Corps, the 47th Panzer Corps, that attacked Bastogne against 1 division. Now, it was a reinforced division that turned out with a unit from the 1 Combat Command from the 10th Armored Division, but nonetheless, it was vastly outnumbered. Troops were outnumbered as much as 20 to 1, and yet we held on. How could that be? It's impossible, right? You know, when George Washington assumed command of the Continental Army the day after the Continental Army was established, what were the odds that this country could succeed in gaining independence? Well, this George Washington commander had no army at that time. It had to be organized from scratch. All we had was militia troops. We were facing, and we had no navy. And we were facing the mightiest army and the mightiest navy in the whole world. What are the chances of success? You say less than 0. But we did it. It happened. Now, at Bastogne, we had troops that were vastly outnumbered, outgunned, and we could not employ those B-47. What were the chances of success? Well, in Hitler's mind, it was 0, that we could not possibly defend. He was going to get to Antwerp, and yet it didn't happen, did it? We managed to hold on. And so let me tell you a little bit more here about what the Germans thought. American parachutists, devils in baggy pants. This is a German. Less than 100 meters from my outpost. I can't sleep at night. They pop up from nowhere. We never know when or how they will strike next. Seems like the black-hearted devils are everywhere. It was a Wehrmacht officer. Everyone thought the American infantry was a little underbaked. This is from another German officer. Until we realized individual American soldiers weren't experts. They had grit, initiative, creativity. By 1943, we Germans didn't think. We knew we were being beaten by Americans. Well, there was a significant attitude. I was going to tell you a few moments ago, before I interrupted myself, about 1942 and the Battle of El Alamein. The first battle that was fought by the Brits. And matter of fact, Montgomery, who commanded the 21st Army Group, was the commander of the British 8th Army at El Alamein, on 2nd El Alamein. The first battle was lost to the Germans, and Rommel, the Desert Fox, gained his name as the Desert Fox after that success. But in the second battle, which occurred in October 1942, something different happened. And a major reason is what I thought you'd be interested in. We had developed the M4 tank beginning in 1940. exactly 1 year after the World War II began, on September 1st, 1939. So 1940, September 1st, the Army, which was the War Department back then, began the development of a plan for a new tank that would be comparable to any of the tanks in existence at that time. Now that was 1940, September of 1940. By 1942, October of 1942, that tank had been completed in design. It had been produced, and Roosevelt, by request of Churchill, sent the first 400 M4 tanks, which are supposed to go to our U.S. Armored Division. He instead gave them to Churchill, sent them to North Africa, where they were employed by Montgomery. And so it was reported that at the Second Battle of El Alamein, as the Brits were coming towards Rommel, he looked through his field glasses and he said to his aide, "Germany cannot win this war." Now, why did he say that? Because he had been to Fort Knox in 1938. There was no such thing as an M4. He knew all the American tanks. He even knew all American plans. There was no such thing as an M4, even in the minds of anybody that he had met in 1938. And yet, here in the space of just a year and a half, this brand new tank was shooting at him. And so he concluded, any country that can produce a tank like that in the space of just a year and a half has the capability that no other nation on earth can match. And so even though he realized strategically that there was no way Germany could end up as the winner, he followed order. He did just as the Japanese did. Yamamoto made the attack on Pearl Harbor, and there he designed the attack. He did everything that was involved in making that attack successful from the Japanese perspective. But when asked by the Imperial staff what the results might be, he said, the attack will enable me to run wild throughout the Pacific for perhaps a year or so. But then he said, then what? The then what is what the Imperial staff didn't consider. The then what is what our own allies did not consider in that meeting when the Battle of Bastogne was initiated. Couldn't happen. And so what is amazing about the American soldiers' initiative, in addition to the grit and the initiative, we are blessed as a nation in that we have a military in which we believe that our subordinates can do the job. Not only the job they have, but maybe the next higher job. And so in America, in our military, we just give a objective and a route to get to that objective, and we leave virtually everything else but how to do it. We tell them the what, and we leave it up to our subordinates to figure out the how. Well, that's not the way it is in other armies around the world. We have non-coms, our sergeants and corporals, who have as much authority and responsibility as officers have in other armies around the world. And so when other armies lose a senior leader, lose a leader at any echelon, those who are following that leader don't know what to do. They wait for instructions to come from somewhere. Well, see, so we have a great advantage in the initiative, vision, and the grit of our military. we were really blessed by what the Depression did in developing character in the United States military. By the way, let me mention something else. This is something that somebody said about the American Navy. It says the reason the American Navy does so well in wartime is that war is chaos, and the Americans practice chaos every day. Well, we're looking at the macro situation when you see this map, and I'm not sure what we have on here, but let me see that. Okay, that's the Ardennes offensive. Yeah, and okay. Finally, you see. There's the C-47 delivery of supplies at Bastogne. Let me switch to the 37th Tank Battalion, which was part of Combat Command R. There are 3 combat commands in an armored division. In an infantry division, we have 3 infantry regiments. In an armored division, you have 3 combat commands, which are the equivalent of a regiment. And Combat Command A, Combat Command B, and then Combat Command R, which was the Reserve Combat Command. The 37th Tank Battalion is under command of Lieutenant Colonel Abrams, who went on to become Chief of Staff of the Army during the Vietnam War. Abrams' 37th Tank Battalion was part of Combat Command R, and he happened to be in the northern sector of the Combat Command R responsibility, and turned out that he was the closest to Bastogne. Now, Patton, before he left for that command meeting, he told his staff that be prepared to make a 90-degree turn. We're going to turn from going east to north and hit Hitler on his flank and cut off that penetration. He was in the south. That never had been, in all of military history, there had never been a movement like an entire army changing 90 degrees in 48 hours. Just not possible. I mean, when you consider the logistics of moving any unit, even down to a company-sized unit, and changing 90 degrees from your attacking objective, you have to consider a lot of problems, because you always have a unit on your left, you normally have a unit on your right. If you turn 90 degrees, now you're going to run right into somebody else's avenue of approach, and you're going to have conflict. You've got to figure out where are you going to get your gasoline, where are you going to get your other supplies, the class 4, all of the different things that have to be determined in advance of a change in direction, and how that's going to intersect other units that are on your flank. All this has to be coordinated. We're talking about the problems at a company level or a battalion level. We're talking about an army of 3 corps, each of which has at least 3 divisions. So we're talking about multiple divisions and all kinds of detail that have to be worked out in order to make a change that Patton was telling his staff before he went to that commander's meeting he wanted them to plant. He wanted to plant 3 avenues of approach, one for each of 3 divisions. And so then he left, and he went to the meeting. And at the meeting, you all remember from Patton movie. Is there anybody that can cut off this penetration? I can do that. It was the 3rd Army. And he said, how long will it take? He said, I can have 3 divisions making an attack by the 26th, or by the 25th. We want to get it done on Christmas Day. And everybody laughed, because it's impossible. You can't do that. I mean, I've already told you some of the details you have to plan for at a low level, let alone a whole army. So they didn't say, no, come on now, be reasonable. Yeah, well, he was being reasonable because he knew the capability of his subordinates, that he had made them toe the line just like he did in North Africa when he went in. He had an army of responsive people who were very capable and very disciplined. And so it was. Well, you might be interested in this, is a macro view that we've been looking at. So I mentioned Colonel Abrams, commander of the 37th Armored Battalion. And he was the closest to Bastogne of any of the units in 3rd Army. And so when he saw these C-47s, they were on the way to drop supplies in Bastogne, which was completely surrounded. It gave him courage. You know, they were facing a lot of resistance. He thought, you know, if we could just get through the next town between his location and Bastogne, maybe we could break through. And so he asked his boss for permission to change the direction of his attacks because of those planes that gave him courage, and of course they were going to Bastogne. So that's the direction of Bastogne. He got the okay to do that. So he sent his company commander, Bulge, Lieutenant Bulge. We have a lot of commanders who are ranked lower than the rank authorized for that command. A lot of battalion commanders who were majors, a lot of company commanders who were lieutenants. Well, Lieutenant August, First Lieutenant August, was given the assignment to take his company and see if he couldn't break through Bastogne. He started out with 9 tanks, and the closer he got to Bastogne, they had to go through one small town. He asked for artillery support, fire on that town, German resistance, so the artillery fell, but the artillery observer was killed, as a result, the artillery was not lifted when Bogus went into the town to get through it, and he lost a couple tanks to our own artillery, as well as half round. But he continued with 5 vehicles, then when he got through this town, German artillery knocked over a telephone pole that fell across the road, and it blocked the path of the half track. So he lost, but he kept going with 3 tanks. So Bogus was still going to Bastogne with just 3 tanks. And he managed to break through wherever he thought there might be enemy machine guns or armor. He told his succeeding tankers, you put around wherever you think there might be a German machine gun nest or any anti-tank capability. And so that's what they did. They kept moving and kept firing as they were moving. And finally they broke through about 4:30 in the afternoon on the 26th, day after Christmas. And Lieutenant Barter saw a GI wearing a GI uniform, and he told him to halt. Who is that? Who are you? And you got to remember, this was a time when the 101st, which had been moved to Bastogne on very short notice, did not have winter uniforms. So they were at Bastogne, and when we subsequently tried to get winter overcoats and winter clothing, boots and so on to the 101st, they were intercepted by the Germans. The Germans took our American uniforms and overcoats, put them on their people, got some of Germans who could speak English, and of course you remember the infiltration of those seemingly GIs wearing U.S. uniforms. So Lieutenant Bulge, when he first saw that uniform, he wasn't sure whether that was an American or a German. Well, it turned out that it was an American second lieutenant engineer, and he identified himself, and he says, "Welcome to Bastogne." Well, you realize that the entire bulk of the Third Army, 250,000 men, boiled down to 3 tanks. It was the fist of the bulk of that army, 3 tanks. Lieutenant Bulge. They broke through, and that spelled the end of the German offensive. Once we were able to link up with Bastogne, it was all over. And Patton said, this time we have the meat in the meat grinder, and I'm the grinder. And so we wound up with a victory because of the grit and the persistence, creativity. Make this quiet. Of our American GI in the face of overwhelming odds. So does that mean that I'm about to begin to start prepare to think about getting ready to commence to stop?
Can't hear you.
Oh, you can't hear me. Oh, okay. All right. We often forget that it is the American infantryman or the American tanker who makes the assault, who is the fist of the entire army. And the Battle of the Bulge and the breakthrough to Bastogne is an excellent example of that. Well, I initially started off by saying that the Battle of the Bulge represents some phenomenal accomplishments as well as colossal problems. I mentioned the colossal achievement of Hitler in being able to put together 26 new divisions and put them along the line without the Allies becoming aware of it. That was just one of the colossal accomplishments. There was a colossal intelligence failure on the part of the Allies. Hard to imagine that we could not have known about such a tremendous change in what was in front of our lines. But that was number 2. And number 3 was the colossal accomplishment of Third Army, the success. And first of all, coming up with an idea that Hitler probably never, ever conceived, never considered the possibility of what happened, although they feared Patton more than any other American commander in World War II, which is why Patton was commander of a fictitious army that was retained in England when Normandy invasion occurred. And Hitler was absolutely convinced that the main attack was going to occur north of Normandy, and because Patton was the commander of that fictitious unit. There were various things that occurred in World War II that were phenomenal successes and phenomenal failures. But here we have 3 colossal experiences in that one battle that are, any one of which is significant in American history. Well, there's a lot we could say about Bastogne. Let me just mention one other story about the importance of an individual. You've got a 2.5 bazooka up here, and let me tell you about one of those that was used in the Battle of the Bulge. A trooper from Brooklyn, New York, private first class, who was an engineer in an engineer battalion that was deployed very quickly to defend a road that the Germans were expected to use. And this 28-year-old battalion commander just had his troops placed in strong points where he thought the Germans might come. This Brooklyn PFC and one of his fellow soldiers were placed at the approach for a road that was completely surrounded by big trees on both sides. So it was a narrow passage, and he was given a bazooka. He had never fired a bazooka. But he was given a bazooka, told that if any tanks came up that road to shoot at him. And so he and his fellow GI were there in the middle of the night, and they heard this clanking of an approaching Panzer. Couldn't see anything. Now, the weather there was much like what we've experienced here in southern Indiana last week. There was a lot of fog. So even in daylight, you couldn't see very, very far. But this was at night. He couldn't see anything. All he could do was hear this tank approaching. Matter of fact, sounded like many tanks. He said this GI took a bazooka that he had never fired, and he just pointed it at the noise. And as the tank got closer and the noise got louder, finally he pulled the trigger, fired his bazooka. The round hit some gas tanks that were on the side of the Tiger tank. They exploded with a phenomenal explosion. The fire was so great that the Germans' tanks that were following could only see the outline of an awful lot of disaster. And there were no way to get around it. These big tall trees on both sides of the road, they couldn't turn off to the side, they couldn't back up. They thought they had a whole regiment attacking them. And so this one American GI, who just had the initiative to pull the trigger at the noise, stopped a Panzer regiment for enough time for them to get reinforced. You never know what the power of a single individual might be in a deployment. Lieutenant Bogus, who took those 3 tanks, kept on going. You know, he kept losing his tanks and his half-tracks, but he kept going with what he did have. And those 3 tanks made it to Bastogne. So this one GI stopped the whole regiment. And we have many stories like that we could tell, but you all might want to look at the bazooka that he used to stop a regiment. We have interesting experiences. There's a couple other things I'd like to mention that you might be interested in knowing about in our military history. That, oh, by the way, when I visited the Bastogne Museum, they had all of the insignia of all of the units of all of the armies around displayed. And one of them was my old 29th Infantry Division patch. When I was in high school, at dinner one night, Pop said, now your grandfather's been in World War I, I was in World War II. If you want to use the car this weekend, you're going to join the National Guard during their recruiting drive. Well, I didn't have any plans to join the National Guard. I knew I was going to be in ROTC when I went to college, but I wanted to use the car. So I signed up. I joined the 29th Infantry Division, the Maryland Army National Guard, when I was in high school. Now at the time, I didn't know there was going to be any particular benefit, but other than the use of the car. But it turned out that was a real blessing, because by the time I was commissioned, I'd had 5 years of enlisted experience. And when I was boarded for sergeant, I reported to the promotion board, and the president of the board was a major, and he was wearing the second Ranger patch on his right shoulder. Now, for those of you that might not know, the Army on the left side wears the patch that you're currently assigned to, whatever unit that is. On the right side, that patch is the unit you served in combat with. Well, when I saw on his right shoulder, 2nd Ranger, I asked him, were you at Normandy? I mean, this was in the 1950s, and so we were just a little over a decade away from the end of World War II. And so I asked him that question, and he said, yes. I said, where were you at Normandy? He says, yes. As a matter of fact, I was in Company D, 75th Rangers, and made the assault on Pointe du Hoc. Now, you remember Pointe du Hoc from the movie Patton, maybe your other reading. That was a strong point where the Germans supposedly had a battery of 88s that could shoot right down on our LSTs. Well, so his objective was to get to Pointe du Hoc and disable those German 88s. And so I asked him a few questions about that experience, going up the ladders and how they managed to get through the resistance. He was the only surviving officer of Company D, 75th Rangers, and was a lieutenant at the time. He won the Distinguished Service Cross, the DSC. By the way, there was Bogus's unit, the 3rd Army, and Colonel Abrams won the Distinguished Service Cross. That's the nation's 2nd highest medal after the Medal of Honor. They didn't give very many DSCs away. So we had interesting circumstance here where I was the one that was supposed to be asked the question. I was supposed to be in there about 10 minutes or so. They were going to ask me about leadership and about my job. I was a common sergeant, and they were supposed to ask me questions about that, determine my eligibility for promotion to sergeant. But you know what? All the questions were asked by the interviewee, and the major who had that experience went through the experience he had in the Normandy assault. And after about 25 minutes, I guess, finally said, all right, that'll be all, Sergeant to be, get out of here. But the 29th Division lost more men on Omaha Beach than any other unit in the Normandy invasion. And we had the largest loss of troops in the Normandy campaign of any of our World War II experiences. The Battle of the Bulge came in second. Now, the Battle of the Bulge was the largest employment of U.S. troops in all of World War II. Okay. So, but anyway, the 29th Division patch was in this Battle of the Bulge museum, and so I wondered, I wanted to see more about that and other things. Well, they had a display of all the insignia of all of the Allies and all of the Axis powers that were involved in the Battle of the Bulge. All of the ranks, from private all the way up to 4-star general. And now all the insignia of virtually every other nation except the United States are symmetrical. So there are pips or crowns or various things that look the same on the left and the right. But in the American display, they had all of the ranks that were displayed except one, American Colonel's Eagle, because the Eagle is not symmetrical. It has to either look forward or to the right. So we have, on a set, you have an eagle looking left and then the other one looking right. Well, there was no eagle in that spot where the eagle's rank should have been. And probably because somebody put a left-looking eagle in there originally, and that's bad luck. So it was pulled out. Well, I asked the director, would you like to have the insignia that's supposed to be in there? And she said, well, yes, I would. Well, I happen to have my military raincoat. And I pulled out my eagle, And I said, here you are. So Bill Willis's eagle is in the Bastogne Museum. Well, do I have time for one more quick story? All right, here's something. You know, some of us are blessed to have some interesting experiences through life. And you know, experiences are far more significant, far more meaningful than things. You know, you can be a multi-billionaire and have a lot of things, but it's the experiences that you remember. Well, those of you that are in the 1%ers are also in the group that remembers the Manhattan Project. The three most secret projects in America during World War II were the Manhattan Project to develop the A-bomb, the B-29, and the Northern bomb site, which was made right here in Indiana, in Indianapolis. Those were our three top secret projects. Well, the Manhattan Project, those of you who've seen Oppenheimer, know that the test site was in New Mexico, Trinity test site. And Oppenheimer had two tracks. He had two different teams working on a plutonium bomb and a uranium bomb. We didn't know which we could complete the quickest. It turned out that both of them were developed to test stage at about the same time. But the first bomb, plutonium bomb, was tested on July 16, 1945. I was in Silver City, New Mexico at that time as a young boy, sleeping on the top bunk, and my little sister was sleeping on the bottom bunk on the 16th of July, 1945, when at 5:30 in the morning, I was awakened by this blast. And I wonder what in the world that is. And then I looked out the window, the sun was just coming up. And then there was a second blast. Well, we did not know at that time what it was. We suspected that it was a blast at the copper mine, which was 9 miles away. But it was unusual for them to be blasting, you know, at sunup. Secondly, it was unusual to be two blasts like that. Well, it wasn't until the war was over in September that we learned what had happened. You're looking at one of those few people that's still around that was alive and heard the introduction of the atomic era. That was the blast at Trinity site, 120 miles from where I was sleeping. And we learned subsequently that the two blasts were caused, first of all, by a ground blast, and then secondly, the air blast, which came a little bit later. So a Trinity test site is something that I vividly recall waking up to on that morning of the 16th of July, 1945. And so we have come a long, long way since that day in technological development, where there might be a drone flying around here somewhere, taking a picture of all of you who've been listening to something about the Battle of the Bulge today. And we may get to the point in technology where you can't even see that drone, that it's invisible, or it may be so small that you can't see it. All these technological accomplishments occur because of Moore's Law. Some of you know what Moore's Law is. It says that the number of transistors on a chip will double every 18 months. So we're now at the point, do you have any idea how many transistors are in your iPhone? Well, those of you that have an i14, it is 9.5 billion transistors, which is why it can do virtually everything. So all this has been in our lifetime. You have seen these dramatic changes, and you're going to see a lot more in the months and years to come. But one thing that you can remember is that history has a habit of making us appreciate what we have had in the past. And so it is with the books that we read and the lectures that we hear, the people that we meet, that increases our appreciation for just how great this country has been and how important it is to preserve it. So let me close with a salute to the flag. You know, all of us who served in the military have a very special appreciation for this flag. And this great big flag up here reminds me of the circumstances under which our national anthem was written in Baltimore Harbor. Did you know that when the Brits attacked Baltimore Harbor in 1814, when the national anthem was penned, that could have been the end of the United States, because Baltimore was the largest port in America at that time, and the Brits had about 5,000 soldiers on board these ships, which were just out of range of the American guns. And they stayed out of range, but their plan was to bombard the Americans and then land the troops, which would then encircle Baltimore, capture Baltimore, and collapse the resistance of the American army. But it turned out that their bombardment through the night did not cause the Americans to surrender. And here is how the intervention of God plays a part in changing an outcome. Because that flag that was flying was a perfect target for the British. And during the bombardment, a cannonball landed on the powder magazine and did not explode. It landed right on the powder. Nothing happened. Had it exploded, it would have ended the resistance. The British would have been able to land. America would not be what we know it today. Circumstances like that can be explained throughout our military history, where a single incident could have changed the entire outcome and our entire history. And had we been a split nation or 13 colonies or whatever, we would not have had the power to come to the aid of the Europeans in World War I or World War II. The whole panoply would be different than what it is. And so we'd be very thankful for our history and for the resolution that Americans bring to the table wherever there is conflict. And the Lord has preserved it, and I ask the Lord preserve each of you as I thank you with this toast to the flag and the significance that that has to all of us who have served in the military. Here's to the red of it. There's not a thread of it. No, not a shred of it, and all the spread of it from foot to head, but heroes bled for it, faced steel and lead for it, precious blood shed for it, bathing it red. Here's to the white of it, thrilled by the sight of it, who knows the right of it, but feels the might of it through day and night. Womanhood's care for it, made manhood dare for it, purity's prayer for it, keeps it so white. Here's to the blue of it, beauteous view of it, heavenly hue of it, star-spangled dew of it, constant and true, diadems gleam for it, states stand supreme for it, liberties beam for it, brightens the blue. Here's to the whole of it, stars, stripes, and pole of it, body and soul of it, oh, and the roll of it, sun shining through, hearts in accord for it, swear by the sword for it, thanking the Lord for it, red, white, and blue. Thank you.
Do we have any questions? Question for the Colonel?
Not all at once.
Norman Kohler is my name. It's not a question, but it took like February to get back where we were before the attack at the Bulge. It took that long.
No.
And a friend of mine was a Billy gunner on a B-17, and they flew over there when the weather cleared up, and they didn't have bombs or nothing. They just wanted to show the Germans the plane, and they just flew over there, flew around, and came back. They didn't bomb anything. Right over here, gentlemen, okay, World War II hat on his far table. His wife is there with him. Her first husband was at the he fought in the Battle of the Bulge.
Very good. By the way, you mentioned B-17, the iconic plane. At the end of World War II, a lot of folks criticized President Truman for using the A-bomb to end World War II. Thought it wasn't necessary, that the Russians were going to be coming in, and they don't know the whole story. And that's why learning history is so important, to give us an understanding of why what happens occurred. Truman was faced with the fact that we were losing 1,000 prisoners a day to the Japanese. They were executing our Allied prisoners at the rate of about 1,000 a day. And so anything that could end the war as quickly as possible would be saving many lives. And it's a good thing that we wound up with a plutonium and a uranium bomb, 2 bombs, because the Japanese did not surrender after Hiroshima was bombed on 6th of August. And the Imperial staff was determined to defend the homeland, even if it cost 1 million Japanese lives. That's what they were willing to do. So it was not until the second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, just days later, that finally the Emperor, Hirohito, made the decision himself that Japan must surrender. It could not tolerate this tremendous loss of life to a single bomb. And so he overruled the Imperial staff. And there were some that wanted to prevent the Emperor from making the public announcement of surrender so that they could continue the fight. And so the 2 bombs were actually necessary in order to end World War II because of the persistence of the Japanese Imperial staff. And it would have cost us, as estimated, 600,000 American lives had we gone through with Operation Coronet and invaded Japan. So Truman made the right decision. Yes, sir.
My name is Tim Walthall. My dad was in the 28th Division, Bloody Duck, and he was in 112th. The artifacts to your left, or your right, are my dad's stuff. One thing I want to talk about, you mentioned before about what a surprise it was. That's one thing my dad always talked about. In the letter that's in between the picture of my mom and my dad was written just 3 or 4 days before the Battle of Bulge. And he's talking about how peaceful it was and how he was glad he got out of St. Vincent and came up there for basically R&R. And the battle broke out and went through the middle of it, and he's talking about Christmas. And I remember when he got home, he said, I couldn't believe that the SOBs were just right across the field from us. You know what I mean? When he wrote that letter. But I want to thank you for doing what you did.
It's been my pleasure.
One thing that is astounding to me about the generation, the greatest generation,
Next.
he was given the Bronze Star. She wouldn't accept it. She said the only hero she knew was dead in the fields of the always unmarked.
I'm sorry. Thank you.
You mentioned 28th Division. When I was in the 29th Division in high school, our annual training was at IGMR, Indiantown Gap Military Reservation in Pennsylvania, which was the headquarters of the 28th Division when it was a National Guard division. It is a National Guard division in Pennsylvania. And it was very significant for me. I was a private, a PFC, I guess, during our summer training, and we were doing KP. We were doing policing up around the barracks. We had the World War II Army barracks at the time. And so my platoon was picking up cigarette butts and all that. And somebody yelled out in our platoon, "Hey, here's a second lieutenant bar." And so the platoon sergeant said, "Give it to Willis." They knew I was going to ROTC when I went to college the next year. And I still have that second lieutenant bar. That was the first one I pinned on my hat when I was commissioned as second lieutenant in front of a whole regiment. But anyway, so the 28th Division is significant, and IGMR is significant in my mind, in my memory. Well, we've got so many interesting stories. You know what? I have a radio station, as you heard. I started it a little over 40 years ago. You know, that's 2 military careers. And my wife and I are still a mom and pop radio station. But because we're in French Lick, we got a lot of conventions that come to French Lick. And some of them big conventions. And anyway, we get to meet a lot of interesting people. So because I have a radio station, I do a lot of interviews. And I've had the chance to interview a lot of very, very interesting people over the course of the years. And also used to put on an annual Global Affairs seminar for the ROA, the Reserve Officers Association, now called Reservists of America. But I put this on for 22 years. And each year, I would try to have at least 4 speakers. I'd like to have a World War II or Korean War veteran, a senior flag officer from any one of the military services, a military author, and a member of Congress, preferably from the Armed Services Committee. So I had somebody like that each year, and there were just an amazing number of phenomenally interesting people. When I was here the last time, I talked about Jake DeShazer, who was one of the Doolittle Raiders. I had 2 Doolittle Raiders during that time. The stories were fascinating. And I had 2 Assistant Secretaries of Defense, 4-star equivalent, and one of my instructors at the Army War College became a 4-star general. I had him as a speaker. And a bunch of authors, including astronauts. And by the way, any of you ever heard Charlie Duke? Charlie Duke. Well, Charlie Duke is a U.S. Air Force Reserve Brigadier General. He's the last moonwalker who can still talk about it. There were only 12. But Charlie Duke, I had a chance to interview Charlie Duke and asked him about the experience of walking on the moon. I mean, that's just kind of so far out, it's hard to imagine, isn't it? So it was a fascinating interview. And one of the things he talked about, we got Don Matlock here. Well, there was a Matlock that was with Charlie Duke when they were on the mission to go to the moon. And during that mission, when they were washing, you know, they had to take off everything to clean everything up. And anyway, Matlock took off his wedding ring, and then he couldn't find it in the capsule. It had disappeared somewhere inside the capsule. And they looked and they looked, they could not find it. So finally, they're doing a extravehicular activity, EVA, and Matlock is out on a tether line, and Charlie Duke is holding that tether line from inside the capsule. As Matlock is facing away from the capsule, looking out into space. And as Charlie Duke is holding on to that tether line, here comes this ring floating, right? And it's going to go right through the hole. And it goes right, and Charlie Duke makes a lunge at it to try to grab it, and his fingers knock it away, and it goes sailing into space, right towards Matlock's helmet. Matlock's looking the other way. The ring bounces off Matlock's helmet and comes straight back through the hole. And it catches the ring. What are the chances? 0. Anyway, there's so many stories that I've had the privilege of hearing over these years from so many different people, and every one of which is worth a story. But you know what? You got inside those 100 billion neurons that are in your noggin, you've got some neurons that have special memories that the rest of us would like to hear. All we have to do is know what question to ask to sensitize that particular neuron and learn the story. But you've all got them. You know, we heard the story about your dad in the 28th Bloody Bucket, and all of you have some story about something. It's different for all of us, but all of them are worth preserving if we could just preserve it, right? So anyway, that's what you all are all about. That's why you're here today, and why you're part of what I revere as one of the greatest productive sources in America, right here in Evansville, Indiana, where you produce something that helped Patton and every other commander of every other component in World War II. Because somebody, somewhere, wherever they were, New Guinea or Europe, they had something that came from Evansville. And so I salute you and thank you for the opportunity to visit.
Thanks, Carl. I appreciate it. Hey, don't forget about our new exhibit back in the back in the kitchen. We'd love for you to have stop and look at it. And the girl will be up here if you have any questions you'd like to ask. In 2 weeks, we'll talk about the failed